Every time you look at your pay stub, glance at the clock at 5 in the evening on a Friday, or rely on unemployment benefits between jobs, you are living inside a system designed by someone you probably cannot name. We take the weekend, the baseline minimum wage, and the strict prohibition on child labor for granted as natural, inevitable features of the modern economy. But they are not natural laws. They are the direct result of a relentless, lifelong crusade waged by a single, fiercely determined woman. Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet secretary in American history, serving as Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt. But her true legacy is far more profound than breaking a political glass ceiling. She is the hidden architect of the American social safety net, the woman who effectively wrote the rules governing almost every aspect of your daily working life. How did a social worker from Boston manage to rewrite the fundamental, unwritten contract between American labor and corporate capital during the nation's darkest economic crisis? To understand how Perkins dismantled the brutal industrial standards of the 19th century, we have to examine the unforgiving world she stepped into. Born Fannie Coralie Perkins in 1880 into a comfortable, highly conservative New England family, she was initially completely insulated from the harsh realities of the Gilded Age. It was an era defined by staggering wealth inequality, where unregulated industrial capitalism consumed human lives with terrifying, unchecked efficiency. Factory workers, many of them recent immigrants, toiled for 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in incredibly dangerous, unsanitary conditions. There was no legal recourse for a severed limb on the factory floor, no pension for old age, and absolutely no safety net for sudden unemployment. The prevailing economic philosophy of the time dictated that the market must remain entirely free of government interference, regardless of the human cost. At Mount Holyoke College, her insulated perspective began to violently shift. She was introduced to the emerging academic field of sociology and the then radical idea that widespread poverty was not a moral failing of the individual, but a structural failure of society itself. This intellectual awakening prompted her to abandon her sheltered, predictable upbringing. She changed her name to Frances, a deliberate act of self-reinvention, and moved to Chicago, immersing herself in the settlement house movement. Living and working directly alongside the urban poor, Perkins witnessed firsthand the devastating physical and psychological toll of completely unregulated labor. She saw children missing fingers from textile looms, families starving when the primary breadwinner fell ill, and the crushing despair of cyclical, inescapable poverty. These harrowing experiences forged an unshakable conviction in her mind. She realized that elite philanthropy was woefully insufficient. Charity could only temporarily bandage the deep wounds inflicted by an inherently exploitative system. She concluded that only raw state power, rigidly codified in law, could prevent the injuries in the first place. This realization set her on a direct collision course with the most powerful political and corporate machines of the early 20th century. She moved to New York City and began lobbying in Albany, plunging herself into the male-dominated, fiercely transactional world of backroom politics. She quickly learned that moral outrage, no matter how justified, was completely useless without actual political leverage. She began meticulously studying the mechanics of power, learning how to present radical social reforms, not just as moral imperatives, but as essential measures for economic stability and industrial efficiency. She was building an arsenal of data, political alliances, and strategic patience, preparing for a moment when the established order would finally fracture and demand a completely new architecture for American labor. The moment that would fundamentally, permanently alter the trajectory of American labor and cement Frances Perkins's resolve occurred on a crisp Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1911. On March 25th, Perkins was having tea with friends in a townhouse near Washington Square Park in Manhattan when the piercing sound of fire engines disrupted the quiet. Stepping outside, she heard a chaotic commotion and followed the crowds toward the Ash Building, a modern 10-story structure that housed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. When she arrived, she witnessed a scene of unimaginable horror that would haunt her for the rest of her life and serve as the bloody catalyst for the modern American workplace. Flames were tearing through the upper floors of the building. Inside, hundreds of garment workers, mostly young immigrant women of Italian and Eastern European Jewish descent, were trapped. The factory owners, obsessed with preventing unauthorized breaks and petty theft, had instituted a policy of locking the exit doors from the outside. The building's single, flimsy fire escape collapsed under the weight of terrified workers. With no way down and the flames closing in, dozens of young women began leaping from the ninth-floor windows. Perkins stood on the sidewalk, frozen in absolute shock, watching as bodies plummeted to the pavement, the impact echoing through the square. 146 workers died that day. Years later, Perkins would refer to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire as the day the New Deal was born. For Perkins, the tragedy was not merely a devastating accident, it was an act of industrial homicide permitted by an entirely absent regulatory state. The grief of the city quickly mutated into explosive, uncontrollable rage. Mass meetings were held, and out of this fury emerged the Committee on Safety of the City of New York, an organization dedicated to preventing a repeat of the disaster. Because of her background in sociology, her experience in the settlement houses, and her growing reputation as a highly effective, data-driven researcher, Perkins was named the committee's executive secretary. It was in this role that she executed a brilliant, deeply pragmatic shift in strategy that distinguished her from other progressive reformers of the era. Historically, middle-class progressive reformers viewed urban political machines, like New York's notorious Tammany Hall, as corrupt engines of graft that had to be destroyed. Tammany Hall controlled the votes, the patronage, and the legislature, operating entirely on a system of favors and political survival. Perkins, demonstrating an acute understanding of the mechanics of actual power, realized that passing sweeping safety regulations was completely impossible without Tammany's support. Rather than fighting the machine, she chose to co-opt it. She reasoned that Tammany's boss, Charles Murphy, ultimately needed the loyalty of the working-class voters who were burning to death in these factories. If she could prove that championing worker safety was politically advantageous, that it would secure votes for the machine, the political bosses would deliver the legislature. Her strategy yielded the creation of the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, a legally empowered body tasked with investigating industrial conditions across the state. Perkins was appointed as its chief investigator, but her masterstroke was in the commission's political composition. She ensured that the co-chairs were two rapidly rising Tammany Hall loyalists, State Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith and State Senator Robert F. Wagner. Neither man was a wealthy progressive idealist. They were hard-nosed, cigar-smoking, practical politicians from the streets of New York. Perkins knew that simply handing them a stack of academic reports would achieve nothing. She had to force them to look the brutality of industrial capitalism directly in the eye. Over the next 4 years, Perkins dragged Smith and Wagner through the muck and misery of industrial New York. She orchestrated unannounced, surprise inspections of factories, canneries, and bakeries. She led the powerful politicians into unventilated basement bakeries where raw sewage seeped through the walls and exhausted workers slept on bags of flour. She took them to upstate canneries where children as young as 5 were kept awake through the night to shuck peas and snip beans, their hands bleeding from the repetitive, freezing work. She guided them up the narrow, winding, highly flammable wooden staircases of garment factories, quietly pointing out the lack of fire extinguishers and the locked doors, asking the politicians how they would escape if a fire broke out at that exact moment. The visceral reality of these inspections profoundly changed Smith and Wagner. The abstract concept of laissez-faire economics evaporated when confronted with the physical suffering of their own constituents. Armed with Perkins's meticulous data and driven by their newfound first-hand knowledge, Smith and Wagner rammed an astonishing 36 new labor laws through the New York State Legislature. This sweeping legislative package strictly regulated fire safety, mandated basic sanitation, established the first meaningful restrictions on child labor, and limited the working hours for women. It was the most comprehensive code of labor law ever enacted in the United States. New York overnight became the undisputed laboratory for progressive social engineering, proving that the government could indeed intervene in the private market to protect human life without destroying the economy. During this intensive period of legislative maneuvering in Albany, Perkins repeatedly crossed paths with a young, patrician state senator named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Her initial assessment of Roosevelt was surprisingly dismissive. She viewed him as a lightweight, an arrogant, wealthy dilettante who lacked the grit and the deep-seated empathy required for serious reform work. However, over the following decade, as Roosevelt contracted polio, lost the use of his legs, and endured unimaginable physical and psychological rehabilitation, Perkins watched him transform. When he returned to politics and was elected governor of New York in 1928, the arrogance had been replaced by a hardened, serious resolve and a much deeper understanding of vulnerability. Recognizing her unparalleled expertise and administrative competence, Governor Roosevelt appointed Perkins as the Industrial Commissioner of the state of New York. She was now the absolute head of the state's labor department, wielding massive bureaucratic power. She assumed this post just as the Roaring Twenties came to a catastrophic halt. The stock market crashed in October 1929, triggering a terrifying economic collapse that would soon be known as the Great Depression. As banks failed, factories shuttered, and millions of men were abruptly thrown out of work, the initial response from the federal government, under President Herbert Hoover, was aggressive denial. Hoover's administration clung desperately to the belief that the market would naturally correct itself, relying on voluntary cooperation from businesses to maintain wages and urging private charities to handle the sudden explosion of destitution. The federal government released cherry-picked, highly manipulated employment statistics, insisting that the crisis was merely a brief, temporary correction and that recovery was already underway. Perkins, overseeing the labor statistics of the nation's largest industrial state, knew this was a dangerous fiction. In a breathtakingly bold political maneuver that made national headlines, the state-level commissioner publicly contradicted the President of the United States. She called a press conference and released New York's rigorously compiled data, which proved definitively that unemployment was not stabilizing, but actively skyrocketing into the millions. She weaponized empirical evidence to publicly humiliate the Hoover administration, establishing that the federal government was either dangerously incompetent or intentionally lying to the American public. She argued forcefully that private charity and local municipalities were entirely incapable of managing a macroeconomic collapse of this magnitude. Only the immense centralized fiscal power of the federal government could prevent mass starvation. By the time the presidential election of 1932 arrived, the country was in ruins. A quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Shanty towns, bitterly dubbed Hoovervilles, occupied public parks. The American public overwhelmingly rejected Hoover's inaction and elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, demanding a fundamental change in the relationship between the government and the governed. As Roosevelt prepared to assume the presidency, he summoned Perkins to his townhouse in New York City. He knew that to rebuild the American economy, he needed a Secretary of Labor who possessed not just theoretical knowledge, but actual battle-tested experience in institutional engineering. He offered her the cabinet position. Perkins was deeply conflicted. Accepting the offer meant becoming the first woman to ever hold a position in the presidential cabinet, stepping into a fiercely misogynistic federal apparatus heavily dominated by powerful, conservative labor union bosses who openly despised the idea of a woman telling them what to do. Before she gave Roosevelt her answer, she pulled out a small, handwritten list she had sketched out on a scrap of paper. It was a manifesto of radical economic restructuring. She told the president-elect that she would only accept the position if he explicitly backed her agenda. She looked at her list and read off a series of demands that, in 1933, sounded like pure political fantasy. She demanded immediate federal aid to the states for direct unemployment relief. She demanded a massive program of public works to instantly put millions of men back on a federal payroll. She demanded the establishment of a legally enforced minimum wage. She demanded a strict, federally mandated ceiling on maximum working hours, aiming to establish the 40-hour workweek to force companies to hire more shifts. She demanded the complete nationwide abolition of child labor. And finally, she demanded the creation of a permanent, universal system of old-age pensions and unemployment insurance, a social security system. Roosevelt listened to this astonishing catalog of demands. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted by the federal government in the history of the Republic. It would require testing the absolute limits of the United States Constitution and entering into a brutal, protracted war with the most entrenched corporate interests in the country. Roosevelt looked at Perkins, the woman who had spent 2 decades meticulously learning how to force political machines to bend to the needs of the vulnerable, and he nodded. He told her he would back her. With that promise secured, Frances Perkins packed her bags for Washington, preparing to write the rules that would govern the modern American paycheck. When Frances Perkins arrived in Washington in the brutal, freezing spring of 1933, she stepped into a city paralyzed by fear and a federal bureaucracy entirely unequipped to manage a modern industrial collapse. The banking system had completely ceased to function. Millions of families were facing imminent eviction. Yet as she took the oath of office, the immediate hurdle she faced was not just the collapsing economy, but the deeply entrenched, institutionalized misogyny of the capital. The American Federation of Labor, the most powerful union coalition in the country, was openly furious at her appointment. William Green, the president of the union, publicly declared that labor would never submit to the authority of a woman. The Washington press corps, accustomed to boisterous, cigar-chomping political operators, relentlessly scrutinized her appearance, her marital status, and her tone of voice, actively looking for any sign of feminine weakness. Perkins understood that her gender was a massive liability in this ruthless environment. Her solution was a masterclass in bureaucratic camouflage. She deliberately stripped her public persona of anything that could be weaponized against her. She adopted a strict, almost severe uniform, exclusively wearing dark, conservative dresses and her signature, unremarkable, tricorn hat. She lowered the register of her voice, speaking slowly and methodically. She cultivated the demeanor of a stern, unyielding headmistress or a highly competent, invisible secretary. She intentionally allowed the men around her, including the president, to take public credit for her ideas. By masking her formidable intellect and radical agenda behind a facade of maternal, administrative duty, she disarmed her critics and bypassed the fragile egos of the men whose votes and cooperation she desperately needed. This was the precise mechanism of her hidden influence. She traded public glory for absolute architectural control over the policies themselves. Within her first 100 days in office, that control yielded staggering results. She immediately drafted and pushed through the legislation creating the Civilian Conservation Corps, a massive federal program that took hundreds of thousands of unemployed young men off the streets, placed them in military-style camps, and put them to work rebuilding the nation's infrastructure and national parks. Simultaneously, she engineered the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, channeling $500 million in direct federal grants to the states to prevent immediate starvation. But Perkins knew that emergency relief was merely a temporary bandage. The core of the disease was the fundamental imbalance of power between employers and employees. To fix the economy permanently, she had to rewrite the rules of the American workplace. The opportunity came with the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. While other cabinet members focused on the complex price-fixing mechanisms of the bill, Perkins zeroed in on the labor provisions. She was the driving force behind Section 7A of the Act, a revolutionary clause that, for the first time in American history, federally guaranteed the right of workers to organize into unions and bargain collectively. Furthermore, she embedded her long-held goals into the industrial codes drafted under the Act, legally establishing minimum wage baselines and maximum working hours across hundreds of industries, and effectively outlawing the use of child labor in manufacturing. For a brief moment, her entire Albany wish list seemed to be instantly realized on a national scale. However, the conservative establishment was preparing a massive counterattack. The United States Supreme Court, dominated by justices holding a rigid 19th century view of the Constitution, began systematically dismantling the New Deal. In 1935, the court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, declaring it an unconstitutional overreach of federal power. Overnight, the minimum wage, the hour limits, and the child labor bans were wiped out. At the same time, massive populist movements were surging across the country. In the South, Senator Huey Long was preaching a radical redistribution of wealth. In California, a physician named Francis Townsend had mobilized millions of elderly Americans with a politically impossible but wildly popular plan to give every citizen over 60 a federal pension of $200 a month, provided they spent it immediately. President Roosevelt, facing re-election and sensing the political ground shifting dangerously beneath him, realized he needed a permanent, legally bulletproof system to protect the vulnerable and neutralize the populace. He turned to the only person in his cabinet who had been demanding exactly this system since the day she was hired. In June of 1934, Roosevelt issued an executive order creating the Committee on Economic Security and appointed Frances Perkins as its chair. Her mandate was staggering: design a comprehensive, permanent social insurance system for the United States from scratch, and do it before the next congressional session. Perkins assembled a team of brilliant actuaries, economists, and legal scholars, but the project quickly bogged down in intense, paralyzing academic debates. Experts argued endlessly over whether the system should be funded by general taxes or payroll contributions, whether it should be administered locally or federally, and how to include complex variables like agricultural workers. As the deadline loomed, the committee was producing hundreds of pages of theory, but no actual legislation. Knowing that the political window for passage was rapidly closing, Perkins resorted to the ruthless tactics she had learned dealing with Tammany Hall. In a move that became legendary in Washington, she invited the core drafting committee to her home, led them into her dining room, placed a large bottle of scotch on the table, and physically locked the door. She informed the most prominent economic minds in the country that no one would be permitted to leave the room until they had agreed on the final structural framework of the bill. It was an act of sheer, uncompromising political will. Hours later, they emerged with the blueprint for the Social Security Act. But a massive existential threat remained: the Supreme Court. How could Perkins ensure that this unprecedented federal intervention into the lives of individual citizens would survive judicial review? The federal government had no explicit constitutional authority to create a pension system. The solution came to Perkins not in a legal briefing, but at a high society tea party in Washington. She found herself seated near Supreme Court Justice Harlan Fiske Stone. Knowing she could not explicitly discuss pending legislation, she delicately steered the conversation toward the theoretical constitutional boundaries of federal social programs. She gently expressed her frustration at the difficulty of finding a legal basis for social insurance. Justice Stone leaned in and whispered a single, vital piece of advice. He told her to base the entire system on the government's unquestioned, absolute authority to raise revenue. "The taxing power, my dear," he told her, "the taxing power is sufficient for everything you want and need." This quiet, unofficial exchange fundamentally altered the architecture of the American safety net. Perkins instructed her legal team to completely rewrite the Social Security Act. It would not be presented as a federal pension or a welfare program. It would be legally structured as a specific tax levied on employers and employees, the proceeds of which would be deposited into a dedicated federal trust fund. The payouts would simply be a return on those tax contributions. By anchoring the system in the undeniable constitutional right of the federal government to levy taxes, Perkins built an impenetrable legal fortress around her creation. The political battle to pass the Social Security Act in the summer of 1935 was vicious. Corporate lobbying groups launched massive propaganda campaigns, claiming the act would destroy American freedom and force workers to wear dog tags with federal identification numbers. Conservative politicians denounced it as creeping socialism. But Perkins, operating tirelessly behind the scenes, marshaled her data, called in years of political favors, and kept the warring factions of the Roosevelt coalition united. On August 14, 1935, President Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. In the iconic photographs of the signing ceremony, Roosevelt is seated at his desk, surrounded by powerful men in dark suits. Standing directly behind him, partially obscured by the men taking credit for the legislation, is Frances Perkins, wearing her plain, dark dress and her tricorn hat. She had just successfully engineered the largest, most consequential transfer of economic security in the history of the Republic, creating the system of unemployment insurance, maternal welfare, and universal old age pensions that continues to deduct money from and ultimately guarantee the paycheck of every working American today. Even with the monumental passage of the Social Security Act, Frances Perkins knew her original 1933 manifesto was still incomplete. The Supreme Court had annihilated the National Industrial Recovery Act, wiping out the federal minimum wage, the maximum hour limits, and the ban on child labor. Millions of workers were immediately plunged back into the brutal, unregulated conditions that Perkins had spent her entire life fighting. She was determined to permanently cement these protections into federal law, but she needed a new legal architecture, one that could survive the relentless scrutiny of a hostile judiciary. The mechanism she found was the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, which grants the federal government the power to regulate commerce between the states. Perkins and her legal team drafted a brilliant, legally aggressive piece of legislation. Rather than explicitly outlawing low wages or long hours everywhere, the bill simply stated that any goods produced by child labor, or by workers paid below a certain baseline, or working beyond a certain number of hours without overtime compensation, were legally prohibited from crossing state lines. In an industrialized, deeply interconnected national economy, this effectively forced every major manufacturer in the country to comply. The political warfare over this new bill, which would become the Fair Labor Standards Act, was even more vicious than the fight for Social Security. Southern politicians, whose regional economy relied heavily on ultra-low wages and an exploited, largely segregated workforce, recognized that a universal federal baseline would destroy their economic model. They launched a massive filibuster, trapping the bill in committee for months. Conservative industrialists warned that dictating wages would bankrupt the nation, But Perkins, utilizing the immense political capital she had quietly stockpiled over 5 years in the cabinet, relentlessly pressured congressmen behind closed doors. She mobilized union leaders, drafted compromise amendments to peel away moderate opponents, and kept President Roosevelt entirely focused on the legislation. In June of 1938, her relentless campaign finally shattered the opposition. President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law. This single piece of legislation fundamentally rewrote the unwritten contract of American labor. The standardized federal minimum wage we know today was formally introduced, setting an absolute floor beneath which human labor could not legally be devalued. The universal standardized 40-hour workweek was established, enforcing the radical concept of time-and-a-half overtime pay, which financially penalized employers for overworking their staff and effectively created the modern weekend. And, completing the promise she made to herself on the ashes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the act permanently banned oppressive child labor in manufacturing. This was the absolute peak of Frances Perkins's power, the culmination of a 25-year investigation into how to bend the machinery of the state to protect the vulnerable. She remained at her post through the entirety of the Second World War, managing the massive mobilization of American labor required to defeat the Axis powers. When Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945, Perkins was the only cabinet secretary to have served with him from his first day in office to his last. Weeks later, she submitted her resignation to President Harry Truman, packed up her modest Washington office, and quietly stepped out of the federal spotlight. The consequences of her hidden influence are almost impossible to overstate. The industrial capitalists who believed human beings were entirely expendable commodities lost their absolute authority over the factory floor. The politicians who insisted that government intervention in the economy was unconstitutional were permanently defeated by her legal architecture. However, the tensions she navigated remain deeply embedded in our political discourse. Does a rigid, federally enforced safety net and wage baseline provide essential, non-negotiable security for a functioning society? Or does it permanently restrict the individual freedom of workers and employers to negotiate their own economic reality? Frances Perkins never sought the fame or the historical glory typically afforded to the architects of American society. She understood that to actually build the systems she envisioned, she had to become invisible, allowing the men around her to claim the political victories while she held tight to the administrative levers of power. She outlived her political era, spending her final years teaching at Cornell University before passing away in 1965. Yet her true monument is not a statue or a building in Washington. Her monument is the architecture of your daily life. It is the Social Security tax deducted from your pay stub, guaranteeing a baseline of dignity in old age. It is the time clock that stops at 40 hours, the weekend you spend with your family, and the profound, silent absence of children on the factory floor. To continue uncovering the hidden architects and the invisible rules that govern the modern world, subscribe to the channel.